200,000 unsolved murders and missing person cases in the United States alone. The majority of these cases never see the media attention they deserve. No matter the person, no matter the circumstances, everyone deserves justice. Come along with us as we seek the truth and uncover the stories of our fellow human beings who will never be forgotten, as long as we continue to speak their names. Welcome to our very first episode of Uncovered, where we will speak the names of those the media so often chooses to ignore. We aim to give a loud, boisterous voice to the voiceless so that they may finally be heard. Today we speak the name of a young property surveyor who's been missing from a work site since 2002. The details surrounding this case are pull your hair out frustrating and completely mind-boggling. So without further ado, may we present the story of Christopher Carlton Thompkins. Chris began his morning on January 25th, 2002 like any other. He was scheduled to work that day, and so he dressed accordingly in a plain black t-shirt, navy work pants, a plaid jacket, a black skull cap, and his tan work boots. He said goodbye to his mother, Martha Ann McKenzie, who he lived with, and left in the car his grandmother had just helped him purchase. He arrived at the office, parked his new ride, and hopped in a car with a coworker. From there, they would carpool to the work site. Once they arrived, it was time to get to work. As property surveyors, the four-man crew would walk 50 feet apart in a line along a designated piece of property, potentially looking for anything noteworthy to report to prospective future builders. On this particular day, the crew reported to a wooded area along County Line Road off of Warm Springs Road. Chris had his tools with him, and he just so happened to be the last one in line. At some point, they stopped for their lunch break and then returned to work. As they walked along the property in proper formation, one of the surveyors was having a conversation with Chris. He looked away for what he described as a moment, and when he looked back, Chris was gone. He called out his name and received no response. He gathered the remaining surveyors, and together they searched the immediate area for any sign of the missing young man, but found none. Just like that, 20-year-old Christopher Thompkins was never seen again. Chris was reported missing to his boss, who in turn called Chris's girlfriend. At some point, a 911 call was made from the worksite. His mother was not informed of her only son's disappearance until roughly 5 p.m. that afternoon, hours after he was last seen, which is strange given that Chris lived with his mother. You'd think one of the first calls you should make is to the missing person's place of residence. The initial 911 caller, along with Chris's family, were told to wait out the apparent necessary 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. No such waiting period exists. If someone you know or love is missing, report them as such immediately. The stereotype of waiting a 24 or 48-hour period before reporting someone missing has largely been perpetuated by movies and TV shows, but in the case of Christopher Thompkins, it was sadly a very careless 911 operator who neglected to act appropriately in a time of need. For Chris's loved ones, waiting any amount of time wasn't good enough, and rightfully so. They set out to search for him themselves, garnering enough manpower to sweep out the worksite without official help. Their search did yield results. At the worksite, they found Chris's tools and a total of 12 cents scattered on the ground. One of his tan work boots stuck on a barbed wire fence, as well as a blue piece of fabric. The fabric matched Chris's navy work pants. The tools and the boot were positively identified as his as well. It's curious to note that these belongings were found hours later by the family and not the co-workers that immediately searched the area upon realizing he was nowhere to be found. Why didn't they find these things when Chris initially disappeared? Once the police were involved, Chris was ultimately ruled a runaway. He had simply decided to walk away from his life in the middle of a workday at a job he purportedly loved. He decided to throw his pocket change on the ground, scatter his tools, and leave a boot hanging on a fence nearby. Today, 21 years later and counting, Christopher Thompkins has never been seen or heard from again since that day in January 2002. His loved ones are left without answers, except for the profound truth that he would never abandon his life, his family, and his friends without communication about where he was going or what he was doing. Jasmine Houston, a friend of his, is quoted as saying, "He's not the type of person who's just going to walk away." His aunt, Rosalind Mathis, said, "He had recently learned what it was to be saved. He had given his life to Christ. He was just an outgoing good guy." Chris loved his job. He had just gotten a new car. He loved his family, had a girlfriend, and recently reconnected with his faith. He had every reason to not only live, but continue thriving in the path he had already carved out for himself. It doesn't make any sense that he would decide to walk away from it all in any circumstance, let alone one random January afternoon without a pair of good boots to combat all the surrounding wilderness. Now, it's difficult to say what's going on in a person's life at any given moment. Everyone has their secrets and their struggles, even ones we keep from our family and friends. But some questions need to be answered. To this day, no other theory has been taken seriously by law enforcement besides Chris being labeled a runaway. Nothing in Chris's behavior reads like a mental breakdown, and he had no history of mental illness. Those sort of things are incredibly common in people who do things like walk off into the wilderness to start a new life. The exact property where Chris went missing has never been publicly identified, aside from being located off of County Line Road, so it is incredibly difficult to pin down specifics of the area we're discussing here. Taking a look at the maps available on Google today, there are a number of properties surrounded by barbed wire fences, but we have to keep in mind that it's been over 2 decades since the events in question took place. In general, we can still get a really good idea of the area we're dealing with here. Overall, it is a very wooded region, with sparse fields and open areas for mostly private homes and a few businesses, including a branch of the U.S. Post Office. It's not as active as a large highway, but it's constantly in use, especially during the daytime. If Chris really did just walk off to start a new life, why didn't anyone see him doing it? Why hasn't someone come forward now to let us know he's alive and well? Some have suggested that perhaps Chris fell into an unmarked well of some kind, but that wouldn't explain the leftover belongings. Others mention the possibility of an animal attack, but there's no way such a vicious assault could occur without brutal evidence left behind. Even if his body couldn't be recovered, blood evidence would have been left to speak of such an attack. Peculiarly, one of the most popular running theories is that Chris did indeed wander off, where he stumbled out onto the road and was hit by a car. His shoes were flung off his body, scattered in opposite directions, and his body was either retrieved by the driver and concealed, or has simply never been found at the scene of the accident. This theory has a way of weaseling its way into the majority of missing persons cases, but it just doesn't work for several reasons. For starters, his boots were not found anywhere near one another. One report says the second boot was found 900 yards away, while another states it was several miles away. You can't make sense of that distance no matter how terrible a car accident. Most notably, the odds of a hit and run occurring in broad daylight and not one person having been witness to the crime is simply not very likely. The driver would have had to get out of their car, assuming it didn't receive irreparable damage, and then finagle the remains of their victim into their car before anyone else passed by. Evidence of a wreck more than likely would have been left behind. Scuff marks on the road from slamming on the brakes, blood, or pieces of wreckage from the vehicle in question. A collision like that is something that draws attention. It can be loud, screeching brakes, the sound of impact, possibly even a horn to alert the inevitable victim of their impending fate. It's imperative to keep the directive of Occam's razor in the forefront of our minds as we dive deep into these theories. The simplest solution is generally the best one. In most cases of a missing person, there are too many elements involved in a hit and run to make it very plausible. There are no images available of the evidence or the scene collected either by police or the family. Chris disappeared before cell phones were largely in use, otherwise we might come to expect a few snapshots from the search party that discovered his belongings at the survey site. It's significantly more challenging to interpret the evidence without photos to show exactly what or how it was discovered. But with the description of his belongings and where they were found leaves us to assume only one thing. The fact that the fabric from his work pants and his boot were found stuck to the top of a barbed wire fence would certainly indicate that Chris climbed over it. The fact that he didn't go back for his things, or at the very least his boot, means he was in a hurry. Struggling over the fence could very well have led to the expenditure of the change in his pocket and perhaps even his tools. If this were the case, why didn't his coworkers see or hear anything? He most certainly would have been able to call out for help if he had time to struggle over a barbed wire fence. And if he didn't call out for help, why not? In conjunction with the fact that his coworkers reportedly didn't hear anything, the theory that Chris climbed over the fence in an attempt to flee can only make sense one of two ways. One, his coworkers were negligent in some capacity. Perhaps they were wearing headphones and couldn't hear him calling out for help. Perhaps they weren't paying attention to Chris, who was last in line, and had no idea when he wandered off or what happened. Then, for some fear of punishment within their employment, lied about the conditions surrounding Chris's disappearance in order to avoid getting in trouble with their boss. Negligence from his coworkers could potentially explain a number of scenarios resulting in Chris's disappearance. It's entirely possible that they had no role in his vanishing except for being irresponsible coworkers. However, in order for this to be true, they would have to perpetuate such lies for decades. If this were the case, they would have every reason to come forward with the truth now. Still assuming Chris was running away and possibly yelling for help, what other reason might there be for his coworkers not to respond or acknowledge that they'd heard anything at all? Chris was running from one or all of his coworkers. The simplest explanation for the evidence found at the scene is that Chris climbed that fence in a hurry. He didn't have time to go back for his boot and just kept running straight into rugged terrain, knowing he had only one shoe. It wouldn't take but a few steps to realize this was going to be a very bad and relatively painful idea. If he'd have decided to simply walk off, he would have had all the time in the world to recollect a shoe, and yet he left it there with all of his other abandoned belongings. His coworkers have officially stated they didn't see or hear anything, even though one of them was conversating with Chris just moments before he disappeared. Nothing has ever come to light that might explain why his coworkers would turn on him, and they were never officially questioned by police. As the last people to have seen Chris alive, we have to ask, why weren't they questioned? A spokesperson representing the family once called for polygraph tests to be administered to the coworkers, but it remains unclear if they were ever done. Although inadmissible in court, a lie detector test can be a useful tool for weeding out ineffective leads and, at the very bare minimum, coercing suspects to make official, on-the-record statements they otherwise would not have made. It could have been used as a last-ditch effort to investigate any possible lead into Chris's disappearance. There is a quote from Sheriff Jolie in the Ledger-Inquirer that said Chris's mother acknowledged to him that her son had used drugs the week before his disappearance and that he had been acting paranoid. Chris's boss had also described him as acting strangely in the days leading up to his disappearance, but could not or would not elaborate on that claim. In the wake of a missing person, it is a peculiar accusation to make with no evidence to back it up. It is important to note that Chris's mother does not believe he was using drugs, so it is unclear where Sheriff Jolie derived this impression of Chris. All too often, drug use is used as an easy cop-out not to dig any deeper into a case. Whether he had a serious drug problem or not, his disappearance deserves to be investigated. In the article, Sheriff Jolie continued to say, "We have done a lot of extra investigation activity for it to be just a missing person." This statement was made regarding the fact that they brought bloodhounds to the scene and swept 2 nearby bodies of water. While these are most certainly welcome movements from law enforcement, the buck doesn't stop there. Chris was not just a missing person. He was a young man with a bright future who was loved and missed and still is. This year marked 21 years since Chris disappeared, but that doesn't mean there's nothing left to uncover. Someone out there knows something. Frankly, the details surrounding this case do not make any sense. No one would walk off to start a new life with only one boot and then later dispose of the other one. Even if he did have a mental breakdown due to drugs or poor health, his disappearance warrants a proper investigation. His coworkers must still have very valuable information about what happened to Chris. Someone who happened to be driving down I-85 or Warm Springs Road could have seen something that seemed utterly mundane at the time. A car parked on the side of the road, someone with his description walking down the interstate, or getting into a vehicle with someone else. Perhaps someone knows some detail about Chris's life we haven't heard before, conflict he was wound up in that could have potentially led to his disappearance. Chris is 5'7" to 5'9" and weighed roughly 124 pounds. He has brown eyes and had braided black hair at the time of his disappearance. He has a tattoo of an ice cream cone on his arm. The ice cream was drawn as the head of a joker with a hat, while the cone had Chris's name tattooed vertically inside it. Even if it seems unimportant or unlikely to be related, report what you know to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation at 706-655-5842 and help bring answers home for Christopher Thompkins and the people who loved him. You can also call the tip line at 800-597-TIPS. With the ability to report anonymously, there is no reason not to come forward. Someone out there knows something that Christopher's family deserves to hear about. Bring them the peace and closure they have always deserved. Help bring Chris home. The case might not be open anymore, but it was certainly never closed. Thank you for tuning in to Uncovered Case Files. It's very important to us that the stories we cover are important to you. If you know of any unsolved cases that desperately need attention, leave them in the comments. And make sure you check back with us every Friday for our newest episode.